My name is Josh Broltheim, and today we're going to go over becoming a Sumo Power Admin, which covers the Level 3 certification. So we have a bunch of slides to cover today to go over administrative features, how to ingest data, and I think you'll get a well-rounded understanding of those features by the end of today. During today's call, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat for the Q&A, and we'll be able to go ahead and answer them. But let's go ahead and dive in here. So what are we going to be talking about over the next hour or two? These are some of the things we'll cover. So in regards to Sumo Power Admin, discussing data collection strategies, what your options are, and what some of those best practices around data collection are. We'll talk about a robust naming convention for your metadata, specifically source category, but we'll get in depth and help you understand why that's important and going to be valuable for your users. We'll talk about sharing and recommending searches and dashboards. By this point, hopefully you understand the value of sharing those things, but the recommended feature is a nice little way to drive your users to notice certain features such as searches and dashboards that might be more useful for them. And then we'll talk about some optimization tools, a couple different ways to enhance search performance. Some of them we'll highly recommend that you configure right now, and some of them are things that we just want you to be aware of, and then down the road, if it makes sense to add those in, then at least you're aware of them. And then we have some other things to go over as well, so more administrative features such as like password policy, security settings, so that'll be another section we'll go over as well. All right, so high-level data flow. You've probably seen this slide by now. If you haven't, let's go over it one more time quickly. What this is showing is Sumo Logic data flow. So essentially there's 3 steps, if you will, to the way the data flows through Sumo Logic or to Sumo Logic, and then what you do with it after. So step 1 is data collection. Very simply, your data is out there in the world, and in order for Sumo Logic to assist you with it, the data needs to be collected and brought into Sumo Logic. And that's the step we're going to talk about in a lot more detail in a few more moments. So getting that data into Sumo Logic, how do you do that? What are your options? And we'll go into that. And then step 2, now that the data is sitting in Sumo Logic, what do you do with it? You search and analyze it. And that's more around our level 2 class around the power user, where you would actually work with some of the operators to start to slice and dice your data. And then step 3, you've probably worked with as well, which is the visualizing and monitoring. Now you've sliced and diced your data. Now how are you going to present it to somebody else? Are you going to use a dashboard? Are you going to alert them? But like I said, we'll be concentrating on this step 1 here of getting the data into Sumo Logic. So enterprise logs are everywhere. This should probably not be a surprise to you guys on the phone. That's probably why you're here. So you may be using some of these properties. You may be familiar with them, but the idea behind this slide is there's a lot of different enterprise log systems out there, or systems that are generating logs, and they can be all brought into Sumo Logic. You may be using some of these, you may not. You're probably using a combination of these, and there's certainly many other besides these. This slide is probably a touch out of date. There's probably new things generating logs all the time, so this is just a sampling. Now, designing your deployment, what are we talking about here? So what we're starting to talk about is how to bring in that data to ingest it into Sumo Logic. At the top of the screen, you have that kind of traditional cloud representing Sumo Logic. And what we have on the left and the right are different, I guess, environments, you can almost call them. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we have more of our traditional environments where we have systems that are generating local files and host metrics that might be sitting behind a firewall, syslog data, remote files, those type of things. And what we're showing here is, well, certainly that data needs to be run to Sumo Logic, but the method you would use is an installed collector. With the collectors, we have 2 different flavors, installed and hosted. Installed is, as the name might imply, is where you would actually install the collector somewhere on your network or somewhere in your environment. So essentially, that collector will grab the data from these local files and host metrics, that syslog data, and bring it into Sumo Logic. We'll talk about that in more detail, certainly, but at a high level, that's the way it works. On the right-hand side of the screen, you have hosted collectors. And so you have the newer properties, the AWS, the GCPs, those cloud properties that are becoming more and more popular. And so same idea, your data certainly still needs to be brought to Sumo Logic, but in this case, you would use a hosted collector. The difference between the hosted collector and the installed collector is the hosted collector is hosted in the cloud, and so you don't have to install a collector. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of both in a few moments as well. Let's go into a little more detail about those collector flavors. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you have kind of your traditional internet cloud graphic that we've all come to know and love. And then you have the data being brought into Sumo Logic through that hosted collector. Pretty straightforward. The data is in the cloud. It needs to be brought into Sumo Logic. You would go into Sumo Logic and tell the system essentially where to grab that data from, providing your AWS role and account information. Then Sumo Logic will go grab that data and bring it into Sumo Logic. On the right-hand side of the screen, you have those installed collectors. And there's two flavors of those, centralized and local. Both acting basically in the same way. They're grabbing data and bringing it into Sumo Logic. But you have two options of where or how that data is grabbed, or who is, it's not who, but what device is grabbing that data. On the top, you have centralized data collection. The idea behind this is you would have a bunch of different systems that are generating these logs, and then you would have a centralized collector installed on a device that would grab all those logs and bring them into Sumo Logic. Conversely, on the local data collection, each device would send the data into Sumo Logic, so each device would have its own collector installed. So one is a centralized version. I don't want to really use the name of the definition, but is going to grab all that data and bring it to Sumo Logic. With the local data collection, those machines will deliver this data into Sumo Logic on their own. Now, what's the difference with a little more detail? What's the pros and cons? And let's go ahead and talk about those. Before we do, this slide is, I don't want you to get too bogged down on the details of this slide. What this is essentially showing is there may be times where you need to install, or at least consider installing multiple collectors based on some of the requirements that are listed here. So if you have, as it says, network clusters in different regions, it may make sense to install different collectors. If you're going to be pumping in a ton of data, more than 15,000 events per second, you might need another collector. And so, like I said, I don't want you to get bogged down into the details of when do you need another collector, but just keep in mind that there may be times where, as you grow, you may need to install more collectors. Now let's go through the data collection options, so those collector options, and the kind of pros and cons or benefits and drawbacks of each one. So the first one we'll talk about is local data collection, and this is where the collector is installed on each one of those hosts, and the log data is produced on the host and then is sent directly to Sumo Logic backend using a HTTPS connection. Now we see these most commonly with the source types that we see on the left-hand side of the screen, so those local files, those Windows events, that current syslog information, those are usually candidates for local data collection. One of the benefits of local data collection is no hardware requirement. There is no hardware requirement. And automation is going to be easier to do. So if you're using something like Chef or Puppet for scripting, local data collection is advantageous in that respect. Now, one of the disadvantages or drawbacks is outbound internet access will be required on those devices, as well as resource usage on the target. So essentially, what that means is those devices that are generating those logs, if you choose local data collection, those devices will need to be exposed to the internet and communicate directly with Sumo Logic. Now, they're not going to be wide open exposed to the internet. You can certainly lock them down, as we would strongly encourage you to do so. But you may have an issue with exposing that device to the internet, even a tiny bit, which is understandable, of course. Typical scenario we see here, as you might imagine, customers that have large amounts of servers, particularly those that are using some sort of orchestration or automation for scripting or something like that. On-prem data centers, cloud instances, those are kind of the popular ones. So now we've talked about centralized data collection. Similar, but more centrally based. So here the collector will be installed on a set or a single dedicated machine, just depending on how large your environment is. And then that machine or that collector will collect the log data from those target hosts via various remote mechanisms, and then the data will be forwarded to the Sumo Logic backend. The source types we see here that are more popular for centralized data collection is syslog data, Windows events, more specifically remote Windows events, that's script data. Now the benefit here, kind of conversely to what we just saw, is no outbound internet access is needed. Since those devices are communicating internally with that single collector or multiple collectors, and then those collectors are communicating with Sumo Logic, you don't have to expose those devices to the internet, which certainly may be advantageous. You can also leverage your existing logging infrastructure, which will be helpful. Now, the drawbacks or kind of cons here, not to say these should limit you from using the centralized collector, but it's important that you're just aware of that. So for example, scale, and like I showed on that previous slide, as you grow, you may need to install more collectors. Not a bad thing, growth is usually good, but it is just something to keep in mind. Similarly, you'll need dedicated hardware, and there could be some complexity with failover. And very simply, you're going to have this grabbing this data from your environment, bringing it over to Sumo Logic. Now, what if that collector, or more specifically, that device goes down? Well, collection is not going to happen. And so you'll want to plan for that and either add some sort of failover or have some decision about what will happen in those cases, because your data will not come to Sumo Logic at that point, and that's not really a good thing. And so you'll want to kind of mitigate against that. Nothing that can't be overcome. Certainly very doable to add failover in those circumstances, but just something to keep in mind. The typical scenario here is going to be customers that have primarily Windows environments or some sort of existing logging infrastructure, such as those syslog or log stashes. And then finally, we have the cloud data collection. As I've alluded to, if your data is being generated in the cloud, this is probably going to be the ideal candidate for you. The source type here, as you kind of could imagine, it's going to be S3 data, that data that's being written to S3 buckets, such as AWS data, HTTPS data, Google 365 data, all those newer properties that are generating data in the cloud. Big benefit here is no software installations needed. That makes things a lot easier since you don't have to install anything. Now, there are some S3 latency issues that we've seen. This is not inherent or specific to Sumo Logic. It's really an S3 thing, but we have seen that there can be latency of a couple seconds or so here or there between when the data is generated and when it arrives in Sumo Logic. We've actually been working with AWS to improve that, and I believe we have. So it's not zero, but it's better. Customers using, typical scenario here, customers using cloud infrastructure. So if using cloud infrastructure, Cloud Connector is probably the way to go. All right, cool. And you will probably be using a combination of a bunch of those collectors. So very likely, unless you're fully in the cloud at this point, there's a good chance you'll use some for your cloud properties and then some local collectors for your more traditional or older systems that are generating logs. Let's go ahead and talk about some metadata design. Now, you may have seen this slide before as well. We're going to get more in depth into it, but this is a good place to start. So what is metadata? And metadata itself is not a Sumo Logic thing, but we do utilize it. And the way we utilize it are these tags that are going to be associated with the log messages that are collected. So your data gets ingested to Sumo Logic, and certain tags will be associated with that data so that you and your users can locate that data. By default, the top four, basically the ones that are not bolded on here, will automatically get applied. So the name of the collector. So you're going to have all these collectors out there grabbing data, and so you will have the data labeled with the name of the collector. Now, for example, the name of the collector or the collector itself, is that going to be a good way for your users to locate data? Maybe, maybe not though. Because with the collector names, you're going to be providing these probably computer names of collector 9321 to one of the logs that are being generated, or collector 4294. Now, are those names really going to be helpful to your users to locate data? Probably not. They might be, depending on the person's role, but many of your users just won't know those names that are being utilized to grab that data. And so this is where you can start to customize and use your own naming conventions, primarily through the source category. It's going to be a field that you can freely configure, and there's structure you can add to it. So you have the ability with the source categories to start to use these components to label your data and make it easier for your end users to find, as well as there's other benefits that we'll talk about. So using these components of component 1 / component 2 / component 3, etc. And so down here in these boxes, we have a couple examples. So if we start on the top left here, the first line here, we have prod /myapp1 /apache/access as the source category. Well, by using that source category name, I know a few things about the data. I know it's production data versus lab data versus QA data versus dev versus, et cetera. I know it's data that's being generated or associated with my app 1 versus my app 2 versus my app 3, et cetera. And then I know it's Apache Access data versus O365 data or anything like that. Now, using these names on the right-hand side of the screen that are the top right, we have kind of the dev version of it, where we're still looking at my app 1 Apache Access data, but in this case, we're looking at that dev or development data. So the difference between the top left and the top right is the environments of prod versus dev. On the bottom left, we have my app 2 versus my app 1. So we have prod for my app 2 and dev for my app 2. And then we have those subcomponents of the type of logs that are being generated. Now with these components or the source category in general, you can see they have different levels. So for example, this prod my app 1 CloudTrail has 3 levels or 3 components. This one here, prod my app 2 Tomcat Catalina out, has 5. And that's fine. You don't need to have the same amount of components. But it allows you to start to take that data, split it up into names that make sense, and then are going to make it easier for your users to locate that data. Now, what are some of the other benefits of doing it this way? You can start to use these source categories for simple search scoping. So a bit of a tongue twister. So for example, we have source category equals prod map 1 / Apache / star, or not / star, but with the star. And what the star or the wildcard is indicating is take everything in the Apache folder or component, if you will, and then everything below that. So with this prod my app 1 / Apache star, we're saying grab all the Apache logs for production environments. Conversely, we have this source category of star my app 1 / Apache star. And what that's saying is grab all the Apache logs for all the environments. So grab it for prod, grab it for QA, grab it for dev, etc. And so with these source categories, now it makes it easier for your users to take the data and start to limit what they're looking for. So if they only want to look for production data, they can do so. If they only want to look for Apache data, regardless of the environment, they can do so. Another advantage is partitions or indexes. Now, we haven't talked about partitions yet, and we will talk about it. At a higher level, you have a general index of data, and you can start to put your data into sub-indexes. And we'll talk about the benefits of that in a little bit. But using these source categories, you can very easily do so. So here I have 2 partitions that I'm creating one for prod my app 1 and one for prod my app 2. So I'm essentially saying all my production data for my app 1, stick it in a bucket. All my data for my app 2, stick it in another bucket. And using the wildcards, I can go ahead and define that very easily. And then you can take advantage of the RBAC roles and controlling what your users can do from that standpoint. So in Sumo Logic, we have the idea of RBAC, or role-based access control, which allows you to start to put your users into groups and then control what those groups can do. So you could say these people are interns and they can only do this function. But with that, you can also start to say what data they can access. So in this case, if we tied this rule to a user, or a role rather, excuse me, we would be saying this role can only access production my app 1 data. They can't access production my app 2 data. They can't access development my app 1 data. They're very locked down in what they can do, which may be useful for certain users or certain roles. Now, those components that I described, what are you going to make your components out of? Here are some suggestions. We've seen others, and it's certainly up to you what you would like to use, but these are the ones that we've seen that are pretty common, and depending on the use case, may make sense or may not. So environment is a really big one. Do you want to start to distinguish your production data from your UAT data, from your development data? Probably, but that's going to be up to you to decide. But if you do, that would be a good component to use, and is one of the more common ones. Application name is certainly a very common one. So the my app 1 versus my app 2, do you want to distinguish that? Probably, so that would be a one that might make sense for you. The geographic information. So do you want to distinguish your East Coast data from your West Coast data, or your New York data from your Chicago data? Once again, maybe, maybe not, but if you do, then a component of geographic information might make sense. AWS region. If you're not using AWS, the AWS regions are probably not going to be a good component for you. And then business unit. Do you want to separate your your sales data from your development data. Once again, maybe, maybe not, probably, but that would be a good one. And then you can come up with any others that might make sense. These are just some suggestions that we've seen. You should group the components together at the higher level based on those that can be searched most often together. And so what we mean by that is on the left-hand side of the screen, we're saying we're more commonly going to search prod data versus dev data. That's going to be a big distinction in what data we look for. Versus on the right-hand side of the screen, we're saying, well, the web or the DB, more the application type, that's really going to be more of a distinguishing characteristic into how we start to locate this data. And so, what makes sense to you? The prod and the dev one is the highest component, is the more common one, but certainly doesn't have to be. You also want to go ahead and kind of plan ahead, if you will. So at this point, you might just be ingesting production data. But if you think that there's a time in the future where you may ingest that UAT data or that QA data, then it probably makes sense to make the component based on environment. If you're never going to ingest anything other than production data, then having a production or an environment component may not make as much sense. Or maybe it makes more sense to put it lower down. So, cool. Ingesting metrics. We haven't really talked about metrics today. We're not going to go too much more detail into them, but this is actually we have one more slide after this one. But what we're showing here is in the same way that we looked at how to ingest logs, you can and should ingest your metrics as well. So based on the type of metrics, where they're being generated, you're going to have a collector there as well. So you might be generating host metrics, things off your device, like CPU disk usage, network information. You may have those AWS metrics that are being generated by something like CloudWatch. Or you might have metrics that are being generated or processed through, like you see on the right, those graphic compatible systems such as Collectd or DropWizard or StatState. And so the same idea that I showed you that hierarchy slide or with the log collectors, metrics, same idea. So based on where those metrics are generated, if they're generated in the cloud, you could use the cloud connector. If they're more locally generated, you might have to have a collector installed on-prem or where that device is. That will then take that data and centrally deliver it to Sumo Logic. So kind of the same idea, just with metrics. All right, cool. So this next slide is going to talk about the sharing and recommending of searches and dashboards. But like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, you probably understand the benefit of sharing through Sumo Logic. But if you don't, let me plug it, I guess, again. And sharing, as I kind of joke about, is important in the world, not just in Sumo Logic. But in Sumo Logic, it's going to be helpful to provide those users that may be new or just where you've done work that could be beneficial for others, you can get it in their hands. So let's say you go through this, you create a query and it takes you a long time. You make this query, it's really nice, it's showing the data the way you want. Well, there's probably somebody else in the organization that can benefit from that query and either use it straight away or maybe as a template. And the same idea with the dashboard. If I create a view that's going to be helpful to me in looking at my data that has some maps and graphs and charts, well, somebody else in the organization can probably benefit from that view as well. And so sharing, is good. But what I want to point out here is the ability to create an admin recommended bucket, as you see right here. And the reason to do so is kind of as the name implies, it would allow you to create a bucket where you can start to put those searches and dashboards that an administrator has recommended. And by doing so, the idea is your user logs into the system and they start to wander around and ultimately, if they want to see what's good for them to use, well, whatever the admin has recommended is probably going to be a good starting place for them or have good information for them. So that's why it's just a place to call out, as it says here, call attention to that content. All right, optimization tools. Let's go over a couple of them. So the first one is partitions, which I alluded to earlier, but let's certainly go into a little more detail with it now. So what the partition allows you to do is to create an index for a subset of data. And so the way Sumo Logic works by default is essentially the data gets put into a general index. So as you start to ingest your data, all of it goes into one big bucket. And when you go to search for that data, you or we go into that big bucket and search around and find what we need and pull it out. Now, what you can do is you can start to create subsets of data through these buckets. So rather than applying your data to a general index, sending it to a smaller bucket. And so why you'd want to do so is, let's say you have 10 terabytes of data, and you're working on a project that's generating 1 gig of data. Well, like I just described, when you go to search against that 1 gig of data, that small subset, you probably don't want to go to the general index and cull through all that data and find what you need. Let the system go ahead and go to that smaller index and find what it needs. It's going to be a quicker improvement in performance. And so this is where you can start to segment those out. Using source categories is a really good way to start to partition your data, as we see on the right-hand side of the screen with the example. Where you could say, okay, take my app 1 data, or the prod my app 1 data, put that in the bucket. Take my app 2 data, put that in the bucket. Or split it up via prod versus dev as buckets as well. Now, you're going to want to use these buckets only for, as it says here, between 1 to 30% of the total volume. It wouldn't make sense to have ingest 10 terabytes of data and then have a bucket that's 9 terabytes, because you're not really saving much. I guess technically you are, but you really aren't too much. There's not going to be much improvement there. So you're going to want to do this with smaller subsets of data, as it says, that data that's searched together most often. The other advantage or reason to use partitions, and I don't have it listed here, but it is a very, very important reason, is with the partitions, you can have different retention periods. So you could start to say, I want my general index of data to be retained for a year, but I want the partition only retained for 30 days or longer, for 7 years, or whatever you need. And so that's a really good reason to use partitions, and I should have it on this slide. Partitions are not something I would necessarily go ahead and start creating willy-nilly, for lack of a better phrase. Now, if you are going to need them for the retention period, that would be a good reason to do it. But as far as kind of a speed performance thing, I wouldn't just start creating them right away. I'd start to wait to see how is my data going to be grouped or searched together, and then based on that, maybe start to create partitions. So it's not something I'd encourage you to go out right now and start creating all the partitions you can. Conversely, though, another feature that I would starting to encourage you to create rules out of would be the field extraction rules. So this one is something that I strongly encourage you to utilize. But let me talk about why this is helpful. So you've probably, or hopefully you've seen the field extraction rules. And what they allow you to do, or the system to do, is to parse your data at the time of ingestion. So with parsing, as a reminder, you're taking your data and you're starting to create fields out of that data. You're saying this part of the log message is an IP address. This is a status code. This is a order number. And so you can do that through your queries, and you certainly should and have probably previously. But with the field extraction rules, you can say, anytime a certain set of data gets ingested, I want to apply this parse rule automatically. And so by doing so, when the data gets ingested, the system can automatically go through it and say, okay, I recognize this Apache access file, or I recognize this data as Apache access. Go ahead and label this as an IP address, this is a status code, etc. And by doing so, there's a couple of benefits, more than a couple, there's many. So one of them is better performance. Since you are going to do the parsing at the time of ingestion rather than in the query, your query will be 1 less line, or 2 less lines, depending on how many parse statements you have. Less lines, better performance. Now, is it going to be 100 times faster? No, probably not. Is it going to be maybe milliseconds or a second faster? Yeah, potentially. So there will be a speed improvement, just whether it's noticeable is something else, but there will be a performance improvement. It's going to allow you to start to standardize your field names. So by having the field names applied during ingestion, you can specifically say, okay, I want to call this field an IP address, this field a status code. If you don't use them, then it's going to be up to your users that parse the data to start to define the names, which is fine. That's not to say that they shouldn't, but they may use different terminology. Somebody might call something an IP address, somebody else might call something a source IP. Now, that's not terrible. That's fine for them to do, but as they start to share queries, it can start to be a little more confusing, because I might grab a query that has something called a source IP, but I'm referring it to it as an IP address, and I try to run it, it's not running exactly as expected. And so this is a good way to standardize that and say, all right, data gets ingested, these are the names we're going to use. Now, users can ignore the field extraction rules. Even though they're in play, they don't have to utilize them, but it makes it easier for them to take advantage of them because they're there. The other advantage is with simplified searches. So since the rules are in play and the system knows what the fields are, you can start to make your searches simpler by using the field name before parsing it. So for example, I could say in the first line of my query, I want to show only those status codes that are equal to 404. And I can really just put status code equal to 4. Because the field extraction rule is in play, the system knows what a status code is or how to locate it, and then can identify those values for the status code. Versus if you did not do that, you would have to parse the data out, and then you would have to have a where statement that says, all right, identify these fields as status code, and then only show where status code equals 404. So the search gets a little more complicated. Not terribly complicated, but it does make things a little more complicated, I guess. Some best practices: building simple, specific rules. And I'll talk about it in the limitation as well, but the idea is you're going to want to create a basic parsing rule that will look at the data and parse it out. This would not be a place to start to add an operator like a count or an outlier. It's just not the right spot for it. You're going to want to test these rules thoroughly and probably use the no drop option for the testing. Testing, well, same way it's good, testing is usually good. And the reason being here is if you go ahead and create a rule and implement it incorrectly, that rule will apply. And then if you realize you did it incorrectly, you could go ahead and correct it, but that change will not be retroactive. It would only impact your future data. And so since we don't want that to happen, we want to get the data right the first time. Ideally, you test it and make sure it's working properly and then implement it. Some limitations. So there is a limitation, now this can be worked around, of having 50 rules resulting in 200 fields. But if you need more than that, and we have customers that use more than that, it's certainly possible. If you just go ahead and send an email or a Slack message to our support team and just let them know, hey, I need more FERs, they can bump that up for you. And then, as I just alluded to, not all operators are supported. So, this is not a place to put outliers. This is not a place to create a map. It's just not the right spot for it. And then, schedule views. This is not a feature that I would encourage you to use right away, but it's a helpful one for you to know what it does and then use when appropriate. So what this allows you to do, or really allows the system to do, is to take a query and rather than running it, which you will need to run it, it gets run in the background. And it gets run in the background every minute. And so then when you want the results, you would grab them and they would be essentially 1 minute old, but they would respond a lot quicker. So where this becomes helpful is, let's say you come in every morning and you run the last 6 months worth of data. So you come in, you have this query saved, you click start, and it grabs the last 6 months of sales data or whatever data and presents it to you. And that query could take a little bit of time to run. 6 months of data, you might have terabytes of information. You could have time to go grab a cup of coffee and then come back and the results will be there for you. So what this option allows you to do is to take that query and save it as a scheduled view. And then in the background, that query will run every minute. And then when you want the results of that query, you would say, show me this view, which is essentially saying, show me this query. And the results from 1 minute ago will be brought in, and it will be much faster because there won't be any processing time because the query has been running constantly in the background. So this is going to be really helpful for, as it says here, with the use cases that create aggregated data where you're looking at long-term trends of data. Now, also keeping in mind that your data will be potentially delayed by a minute. If you're looking at the last 6 months of data, do you need down to the minute? Probably not, maybe, but most likely you don't. So this would be a good candidate for it. And so to do so, you would just take the query, submit it in the system under the schedule view section, and then that query will start to run. And then you would just ask for that view, as it says here on this third bullet point, search view using the view name. and then those results will be back, like I said, pretty much immediately. So this is going to be a helpful candidate for you if you come in and you realize you're searching for long-term trends, as it says, or if you're doing repetitive queries and you don't mind that query being delayed by a minute, this will be a good feature for you as well. So wanted to point it out. Like partitions, it's not something I would necessarily say go and start doing, but now you know what it is and hopefully you understand how it can be helpful. This last slide here is just showing the optimization tools and kind of based on what you want to do, what would be a good optimization tool to utilize. So as it shows here, if you want to extract fields from logs, well, field extraction is going to be a good thing for you to use. If you want to segregate your data by metadata, partitions are probably a good candidate. And then finally, for this slide deck, a bunch of summary stuff that we went over, but really the call to action is what I want you to come away with today. So if you come away with anything from today, and hopefully come away with something, the two things that I'd like you to keep in mind are the benefits of field extraction rules. Using those and having good names and rules in place for both of them will really make your end users' lives easier, and as administrators will probably then make your lives easier as well, because easier life for users, easier life for admins usually. All right, cool. Let's see. Are there any questions about this so far? All right, no questions, so that's a good sign. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to another deck, going over some more administrative features, but more, I guess, more security-based rather than ingestion-based. So let me go ahead and switch decks here. And here we go. All right, so here we're going to talk about administrative features, but like I said, more from these type of security settings, role management, kind of views of things. So when you first log into the system, you'll have access to the account overview. As you can imagine, it gives you an overview of your account. It's a bit of a static or kind of flat page. I'm going to show you a better way to get this data. But this is a helpful way to see, if you come in and you want to know what your billing period is or how much data you're ingesting, this is certainly a good way to look at that data. Like I said, I'll show you a better way, but this is a good way to do so. But what is a better way is going to be to take the data volume tracking that we allow or encourage you to use. And so what you can do is when you first log in is you can check this box for data management. What this will allow you to do, or allows us to do, is start to manage your data volume, so keep track of it. And then ultimately you can start to use some apps to go ahead and look at that data. So I'll show the apps in a little bit, but I just want to show you where this feature is. Another feature that we'll talk about is some security settings, as I alluded to. So password policy, we have one, and we allow you to define it. So you're probably familiar with these type of settings. This is where you can go in and say, I want the password to expire after this much time. How often can they reuse the password? You have the ability to configure and require two-step verification. So if you want to force your users to enter a PIN code when they try to log in, you can go ahead and do so. Your users also have the ability to set that up on their own. So if you decide you want to make it optional, but your end users decide, well, I'm more security focused, I do want to use it, they can still set it up on their own. So it still allows for that. So these are just your traditional password policy settings. We'd encourage you, if you don't have some policy in place, probably use the default. If you do have some policy in place, probably mimic those here. You have the ability to utilize the service whitelisting settings, and these are actually going to apply to two different areas. So the way these are going to apply is you're going to be able to whitelist either an IP address and or CIDR range, which is a group of IPs. And these can be helpful in two different areas. The first place that these can be helpful is to enable login or API whitelisting. And what that means is basically you can say, I only want people that are coming from this specific IP or this CIDR range to be able to log into Sumo Logic. They're not coming from this IP address, they can't log in. Or I only want people from this specific IP to utilize the API. And so if they're not coming from that IP address, they can't use the API. Very simple. Now you have the dashboard whitelisting settings as well. And so what this is going to allow you to do is, hopefully you remember that when you go ahead and share your dashboards, you can share them worldwide with anybody, which is a powerful feature on its own, kind of good or bad. But what this allows you to do is start to control that. So you could say, all right, I only want people that have that URL and are coming from my New York office or my Chicago office, those IPs, they can go ahead and look at that dashboard without needing a login. Anybody else in the world, they need to log into Sumo Logic. So this is a way to start to control that. So that if you're going to share your dashboards with your partners, for example, this might be a good place to put those IPs in here. If you don't care that anybody in the world gets that URL and can view it, then you don't really need this section. But it's important that you understand where it is and how it functions. The next feature is access keys. So what this allows you to do is to create an access key and access ID pair that can be used for authentication. And primarily this is going to be used for two different places, either when you're using the API or when you go to install the collector. So when you install the collector and the API, we don't want you using your personal credentials. We don't want you using your username and your password for a couple of reasons. One, you may not want that exposed, so you may not want to reveal your password, which is understandable. The other place helpful is as you start to set up that collector or the API, what if your password changes? Well, if you use your password when you install a collector and your password changes, that collector will not work, and so that's not good. Similarly, if you use your credentials and you leave the company and we deactivate or you deactivate a user's account, then those credentials will no longer work as well. So the access key and ID pair allow you to still log in, but not use your credentials. And even if you disable the user, those credentials can still work. And so this is why we want you to use these when you, like I said, primarily for the API and the collector installation. And we'll go through, in a few minutes, we'll go through a lab where we install the collector, and we'll see actually how to use this access ID and key pair. Well, you probably know how to use it, but we'll take a look at it. Policies, you have some. So what you have here are, in this case, 3 different policies that you can start to control. And so let's explain what these are. The first one is Sumo Logic auditing. By checking this, it's going to allow you or allow us to start to enable the auditing of your records for your account. And what that means is we can now start to keep track of, or you can keep track of, we do the action, but you'll have access to the data of what your users are doing. Who created a query, who created a dashboard, who deleted a query, what were they searching, all these different things. Now, this is a feature that's going to be disabled by default, and I would strongly encourage you to go in and enable it right away. Because what we've had happen in the past is, and you're probably familiar with this as administrators, is somebody comes to you and says, hey, I think Bob was doing something suspicious. Can you tell me what he was doing? And without this check, we can't tell you, and you won't really have a good view into what's going on. So this is a good thing to enable, and then if you ever need to be able to report on what a user's doing, you have that access, that data has been saved for you. I'll also show you an app that you can utilize to look at this data. So I'll show that in another few moments. The middle option here, support account access. What this allows you to do, or actually in this case allows us to do, is to have our support agents be able to access your account. Now, what that means is our support agents, and only those that have been vetted and gone through security clearance and those kind of things, can then access your account. And what they get is essentially a view in the same way you would view your account. So they go in and they see the panel on the left-hand side of the screen. They see your personal things you've saved. They see your queries, your collectors. It's basically the same view you get. And that's really going to be helpful for them in assisting with any sort of diagnosis or troubleshooting. Now, this feature, some people may not be comfortable with it because it gives our support agents access to your account. And so if you don't want to enable this, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to. That being said, if you do ever reach out to our support team, the first thing they will do is ask you to enable this feature. So in that case, you would contact our support team. You would go ahead and enable this, work with the rep to figure out your issue. Once it's resolved, then go ahead and just disable this. So it's important that you know where it is, not necessarily that's enabled all the time, If you want to enable it all the time, you're certainly welcome to. It doesn't, no one's really going to look at your stuff. But if you don't, at least you know where it is, so that if support tells you, you know how to get it to it. And then you're going to have this share dashboards outside the organization option. So I alluded to this just a moment ago with whitelisting, but this allows you as an administrator to decide very simply, do you want to allow users to share the dashboard outside the org? Yes or no? Case could be made for either one, but this is where you control that. So if you don't want to, very simply just disable it. If you do, enable it. And then you have access to SAML, or single sign-on. So if you're using some sort of system for SSO and you want to use that in Sumo Logic, and we strongly encourage you, so it makes your users' lives a little bit easier to get into Sumo Logic, this is where you set it up. All right, user and role management. So here we're going to talk about roles. And by default, there's going to be 2 roles already created in the system. Now, you don't have to use them, but they are good roles, and we created them for a reason. The first role we automatically created is an administrator role. As you might imagine, it would be used by administrators, and this user can manage users and roles as well as manage collectors. So it's meant for managing that stuff. Then we have an analyst role that we created, which is going to give that user or that role and people that have that role full data access, but they won't have user collector management because they shouldn't really need it as an analyst. And those are just 2 we created. If you want to use them, great. If you don't, you don't have to, of course. As you start to add new users, it's really pretty easy. You're going to put the first name, last name of the user. You're going to give us the email address, and then you're just going to check what roles you want to have applied to them. With the roles, you're going to start to be able to define the capabilities of what the user can do or what the role can do. And so in this example here, I created a role that's called Apache only, and I've started to say what this user can do, or once again, what this role can do. And so here are all the options. And there's probably even a few more now. And so, do you want them to be able to manage collectors? Yes or no? Do you want them to be able to view collectors? Yes or no? And so on and so forth. And very simply, just check off those things you want them to have access to. As you start to create these roles, you can also start to utilize the search filter, which I alluded to when we went over the source categories. Because what this is going to allow you to do is start to say, I only want those users to access this set of data. So here I'm saying my Apache only users, or those roles, those people that have that role, can only access the source category of lab/Apache. And so what I'm saying by that is they can access only lab Apache data. If they want to access lab 0365 data, they can't. If they want to access production Apache data, they can't. So they're really locked down to what they can do in a good way. So that way you can say somebody can have wide open access and somebody can be limited to maybe just a project they're working on. And now I want to talk about apps. Now you probably or hopefully at this point have seen the apps. And we have apps that you can utilize for administrative features as well. So I'm not going to go over the app benefit here of why you'd want to create an app for Apache or 0365. Hopefully you understand that by now. And if you don't, very simply what the apps do is allow us to provide you some queries and dashboards we think are useful. Because we know what logs are going to look like, and so we could say if you're using Apache data, use the Apache app, and here are a bunch of dashboards that we think will be helpful, and queries that we know follow the Apache log format, and so you can use them. But I want to talk about here are recommended apps for administrators, and there's 2 of them. And they're the 2 that I referred to earlier that you could check the boxes to enable. So the first one, or in no particular order, is data volume. And what this will allow you to do is start to see your data volume by these various details. And I'll show you an example in just a moment. And then you have the audit app, which will allow you to look into your audit events. So what are these like? So let's go ahead and dive into them right now. So let's see, am I still logged in? I am. And so to set them up, I would just go to the app catalog and look for the audit app. And there it is. And then I would click Add to Library. Now I've already installed these, so I'll skip over that step. But what I have here are a bunch of different dashboards around audit data. So let's start with account management overview. An overview is a good place to start. And so what this is showing me is information about what my users are doing in Sumo Logic. Now I'm in a test environment, so I don't have a ton of data, but you can still see the admin activities over time, geolocation of admin activities. I guess nobody's done anything administrative recently. And then you can start to look at these other things. So let's say, let's look at library content, created, deleted, moved. Let's see if there's anything in here. Cool. So what we see is here's the content that was created over the last 24 hours. No content was deleted. Here's who created that content, and then what content was updated. If we look at login and credentials, this is probably going to be a little more useful. You can now start to see who logged in, where did they log in from, who tried to modify their password, and those things, et cetera, et cetera. All things that can be very helpful in tracking a suspicious either user or suspicious activity. Now, the other one I wanted to show is data volume. And as you can imagine, it's going to show us information about data volume. So now when I click on the overview, what I'm going to be presented with is various information about the data that's being ingested into Sumo Logic. So here I see the log information, the top 5 collectors that's generating data, the top 5 source categories of data that's being ingested. Here I have the metrics information. And then I can get more granular. So maybe I just want to look at log data. Now I can start to see, and it will take a moment to load, but I can start to see data ingest trends, outliers in regards to data ingestion and things like that. And we created this with the example, or not the example, but the use case of people coming to us and saying, hey, I'm ingesting data. How much data am I ingesting? What am I ingesting? And before we had this, it wasn't very easy to locate, but now it's a very straightforward graph. And so if you're curious, what's ingesting the most data, well, here it is right there. These are the top 5 collectors. And then you would use this data to then decide, should we be ingesting 8.6 gigabytes of VMware data a day? Is that more than we need? Is it less? Do we need to up our contract? Do we need to, check for these things? Here we have some outliers, which is showing us trends in our ingestion, and then when those trends are a little bit outside the norm. Once again, helping us decide, do we need more plan? Are we going to be ingesting more data? And just making you aware of these things. Cool. All right, so let's see. Any questions so far? All right, cool. No questions. Oh, see a question? And for the questions, you guys are on mute, so if you want to just put them in the Q&A or the chat, we'll go ahead and grab those. I see someone raise their hand, but I didn't see the question up here yet. Yeah, we'll go ahead and continue, and I'll jump back to it if it pops up. So let's see, what should we go over now? What is the app you are describing? So the app I'm describing, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but the app I was describing was the data volume app. So if you go into the app catalog, and the audit app was the first one I showed, and then the second one, if you just go ahead and search for data volume, there it is, and you just click add to library. To set it up is even easier than adding a normal app, because you don't need to tell us where the data is, because we know where it is. You don't even really know where it is. And so you would just give the app a name. In this case, I just have one saved already, so I'll just add some initials or numbers on it. And then click add to library. At this point, the system's taking the app data, the data volume data, excuse me, taking these queries that we've created for you and just, like I said earlier, kind of smushing them together and then giving you the benefits of them. And so now I have access to that live data. Cool. So what I think we'll do now, and I haven't done this in a virtual setting before, but let's try it and see if it works, is do a lab. And so the lab we're going to go ahead and do is actually installing the collector and seeing data flow from your device to through the internet to Sumo Logic. So to do so, we're going to need to log in first. So let's go ahead and provide you some credentials. So we'll go ahead and use these credentials for today. So if you want to go ahead and log in to Sumo Logic using these credentials, please do so. If you want to use your existing or current live account, you're certainly welcome to. We're not going to do anything malicious to it by any means, but I can understand not being comfortable doing this in a production environment, and so that's why we give the test environment or the lab environment. So go ahead and log in here. I'll give you guys a few moments. The password, just in case you're not familiar with it, is Sumo Labs, capital SUM 0, capital LABS exclamation point. So that's a 0 in there. kind of trips people up often. So go ahead and log in, and I'll give everybody a moment. All right, let's go ahead and continue. I did put the credentials in the chat, so just if you need them, you can grab them from in there. So once you're logged in, you'll be brought to a screen that looks pretty similar to this. Hopefully this is not your first time logging into Sumo Logic. If it is, it's okay, but hopefully you're sort of familiar with this. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the Learn tab. So we're going to be brought to Home, and we'll go to Learn. And the first option here will be Set up Sumo Logic Tutorial, Install a Collector. So we'll just go ahead and click on that first option. Now, before we begin, there's a couple steps here. And actually, we're going to go ahead and do a middle step first. Actually, yeah, let's go ahead and do, actually, let's start from the beginning. It should be okay. Cool. So when we first log in, what we're going to do is we're going to grab this text file here. So there's a file that says Apache Access Logs Tutorial. We're going to go ahead and grab that file, so save it. What we're going to be using this file for, actually I want to grab the text version, is we're going to go ahead and use this as one of the sets of data. So we're going to go through this use case of your system is generating Apache data in this test file. How do we get into Sumo Logic? So we'll grab the test file. I'm just going to make mine, call it that. So now we should have that file of data saved. We need to install the collector, but before we do that, let's go to the download the collector package. So we'll do the download collector package first and then go back to the install collector step. So to download the collector, we're going to go into the system and we're going to go to manage data. Under manage data, we're going to go to collection. And at this point, we should see all the collectors. So this collection screen, if you haven't seen this before, is showing us all those collectors that are installed and whether or not they're functioning. But we're going to install a new collector. So we're going to go to the top right and go to Add Collector. And then we're going to select Installed Collector. And then we're going to select the collector that matches the OS or the environment that we're using. So I'm going to grab my Mac collector. And you might grab, whatever OS you're using, like I said. And then that collector will download. So it's not that large of a file, usually about 100 megs or so. And so I'll let that collector install, or rather download, excuse me, and then we'll install together. So at this point, I'll pause for a moment, but just to kind of make sure we're all caught up. At this point, we should have installed we should have downloaded the text file, and then we should have started to install the collector by going to the black bar on the left, Manage Data, Collection, Add Collector, Installed Collector, the flavor of collector we want, and then that should download. So you should have two downloaded things at this point, the collector and then the text file. Okay, cool. The collector might still be downloading for you, just depending on your bandwidth, which actually 100 megs is not that big of a file, so it should be pretty quick. So let's go ahead back to the lab. And now what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and generate the key. So this is the key that will be used in lieu of the username and password. So to do so, we're going to go ahead and click on our username on the bottom left, and that should expand out into some options. And one of the options that we'll have is preferences. And then under preferences, we should have this ability to add access key. So we'll go ahead and click add access key, and we'll give the key a name. So, I'd encourage you to use your initials, first name, just some way for you to kind of identify the key. So I'm going to just call mine JB for my initials and key. I'm feeling very creative this morning, but that's a good name. And then I'm going to click create key. When I do, I'm going to get two pieces of information. I'm going to get an access ID and an access key. And we'll utilize these in a few moments when we install the collector. So go ahead and leave these up on your screen. These are the only times that the access key will show up. So if you are in an organization where you save your keys to like a locker, this would be the place to grab those keys and paste them into that locker. But we'll grab them and paste them in a few moments. So just go ahead and leave the screen up. But now let's go ahead and start to install the collector. So we'll just take the file for the collector and just run it. Now we'll go through some of the steps, but the basics of installing it, you run it, and then just go through some of the steps for installation, terms and agreements, things like that. But I'll show you what will change in a few moments. So let's see, a couple questions. All right, so let me go ahead and pause here while my collector is being installed. So at this point, we should be doing, we basically have done a couple steps, and I just want to make sure everyone's clear on them, because I may have gone a little bit too fast, so I do apologize for that. So the first thing we did was we grabbed the set of data that we're going to use. So we'll use that text file in a few moments. The other thing we did is we grabbed the collector that we need to install. So as we discussed earlier this morning, there are a couple different flavors of collector. There's the installed collector and there's the hosted collector. And based on where your data resides, will kind of lead you to decide which collector to use. And so we're going to use the installed collector. And so we need to grab the actual application of the collector first. And so that's why we were going to the manage data, going to the collector, and adding the collector and downloading that flavor, so the OS version, based on whether we're using Mac, Windows, etc. And we have collectors for all different OSs out there. So now we're going to go ahead and start to install the collector itself. But the other thing we did before we do that is we went ahead and did the access key, because we need that key to help us authenticate into the system. So to get that key, we went ahead and went to our user at the bottom left. So we look for our username and we'll click on it. And there's going to be preferences that are going to be associated with our account. Now, you may have not seen these before, but you have some things that you can start to control for your own user, things like time zone and what certain buttons do, whether or not you're going to reopen tabs, just personal preferences. And one of them is the ability to create an access key. So we're going to go ahead and do so, and we're going to add that key. And as I said earlier, give that key a name. The name doesn't really matter for today, but I'd encourage you just to use your initials or something just so you can recognize it. Then you're going to create that key, and that key is going to give you two components to it. It's going to give you the ID, and it's going to give you the key itself, and they're a pair that work together. We're going to use those when we install the collector. So at this point, we want them just up on the screen. So now that we have our key, now we can start to install the collector. So to install the collector, we're just going to double click on the application we grabbed, and we're going to start to go through the installation steps.
Hey, Josh,
someone
on the chat just mentioned that you're going a little too fast, so you might just want to slow down a bit.
Yeah, that's why I'm hoping I'm redoing this little area, so I hope people are following with it. But good feedback. Thank you for that comment. I'll be more cognizant of that going forward. So we're going to go ahead and install the collector, and so the steps are going to be sort of straightforward, where we're just going to next through a few things. But I do want to call out some things during that installation that we do want to at least change or be aware of. So we have the collector set up, so we're going to click next, and now we have terms of an agreement. We're going to go ahead and accept those. We're going to decide where do we want to install it to, what directory. I'm going to use the default directory. Probably would encourage you to do the same. And now the collector is starting to install, starting to extract the files, expand out, typical application being installed. Now on this screen, it's going to give us the ability to choose advanced settings. And I'd encourage you to choose it because there's one thing I want us to change or possibly change, and that's the collector name. So as I described earlier with the things that get applied to your data, collector name is going to be one of them. So here, we're going to want to make sure that the collector name we use is something that we can recognize and going to be different for us versus our other people on this call. So make sure the collector name either has your name, has your initials, has funny word you're used to looking for, just some way for you to distinguish your collector versus someone else's, because we're going to use these collectors and these names shortly. So I'm going to use, I'll actually just go ahead and put a couple numbers. So I'm going to use this name. And then I'm going to click next. The rest of the settings in this portion right here are fine. So we're just going to go ahead and get to this screen, do advanced settings, change the collector name to something just a little more common, or something that we can identify, and then click next. And then we're going to next on this screen. Now here we're going to decide how do we want the system to authenticate, what credentials do we want to utilize. And so this is where we'll check the access key button. We'll check that option and click next. And now we're going to go ahead and take that ID and key and paste it into this screen. So I'm going to take my ID, copy it, and paste it in. I'm going to take my key, copy it, make sure you get all the characters, or just use the copy button, and paste it in. So at this point, you should have the access ID and the access key pasted in. The access key you won't be able to see because it's hidden. But now I have my ID and my key in the installation of the collector. And once that's in, I'll click next. When I do, as it says, while we connect to Sumo Logic, the collector is now attempting to connect to Sumo Logic. If it establishes a proper connection, then you'll get this screen, which basically means you're done. You click finish to exit the setup. So at this point, what we've gone ahead is installed the collector using the access key and ID pair. And with that last step, we verified that the connection is established. If the connection was unable to be established, either because you entered the key incorrectly, or maybe your firewall is locked down on your device and you're not allowed to install the collector, or something like that, you would then get a message saying connection failed, essentially. Okay, so now we have the collector installed. And I'll go ahead and pause and just make sure everyone's caught up, because yeah, I was probably going a little bit too fast. So I'll just wait a minute and make sure we're all together. And if you have any questions, please post them in that chat or Q&A. Okay. So at this point, now we want to go ahead and see that the collector was installed. Now, we know we just installed it, but let's see it in the system. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to Manage Data on the black bar, and we're going to go back to the collection. And now at this point, our collector should be installed. So now if I go ahead and search for my collector based on the computer name, so if I look for that J Realtime, I now see this collector is installed. And I'm going to get rid of this old one that I had. So now what I should see is this line. And you should see a line pretty identical to this, with just a different name here. And what this is showing us is a collector that has been installed. We see the type of collector. So we see it's an installed collector versus a hosted collector. We see the status. The green check mark just indicates, not just it's a very important check mark, but it's indicating that a successful connection has been established with the connector, with the collector, and is ongoing. If it was not ongoing or the collector was down, we would see a red X here. So, and then we see some other stuff about sources and messages, and we'll look at that in a little more detail in a moment. But so at this point, we see that the collector is installed, and hopefully you see that as well. Assuming you do, now we need to start to add some data into the system. Because right now, the system is looking at the collector and communicating with the collector, and they're connected, but there's nothing being transferred back and forth because the collectors have been running on my laptop or on your laptop, but we haven't told it what to transfer to Sumo Logic. And so that's what we're going to do with this next step. So if we're using the labs, this will be part 2. And I'll try to go through this a little slower. And so with part 2, what we're going to start to do is add a source in. Basically, we need to tell the collector what data do we want it to grab. And that's what this portion will do. And so I'll go through these steps And then I'll give you a few moments to go through this as well, and I think that will give you some time. So let me go through them first, and then I'll pause. I'll give you some moments to go through them, and then I'll not repeat them, but kind of highlight them again. So what we want to do first is we want to add a source of data. Because at this point, like I said, the collector is up and running, it's communicating, but it's not grabbing any data, but we need to tell it how to. So to do so, we're going to go to Add, and we're going to choose Add a Source. We're then going to start to decide what source of data do we want to add. In this case, it's going to be a local file, meaning the file is local to the collector itself. So we'll choose local file. Then we're going to fill in these couple of blanks. So we're going to decide what name do we want to apply to this data that's being ingested. Now we'll use the source category in a few moments, but this is just a general kind of label name. Could be pretty much anything you want. Should be something that makes sense, of course. Then we're going to tell the system what data we want it to grab. So in this case, I'm saying grab this file that I downloaded. This is that Apache log file tutorial. I just renamed it something just a little easier. And so I'm telling this system, go to the collector, go to this directory, this directory, this directory, and look for this text file and grab it. And then I'm going to define a source category because I want to then start to label my data as it gets ingested. So I'm saying here, go ahead and any data that gets ingested, use this source category. If JB is going to be the top component, and then the second component will be Axis 111 to match my file name. I have other settings in here, but at this point, we're just going to click Save. And so what's happened now is the system has now communicated these settings to the collector. So it's sent them downstream, essentially, to the collector. And the collector now knows, hey, I should look for the file of user/jbrawltime/download/111.txt. Let me go ahead and grab that, and let me start to ingest that and bring that into Sumo Logic. And once that occurs, we should start to be able to look for our data. And we'll start to see our data ingested. So let's go ahead and take a step back. Let's do that step now. So we're going to go ahead and follow part 2. So I'll give everybody a few moments to go ahead and do so. And and then I'll jump in. Oh, I just put myself on mute while you guys were doing that lab. That's why I wasn't talking through the screen, so apologize for that. All right, let me go ahead and show you what you should have just done, and let's verify your data is in there. So what you should have done is, as the step showed, go ahead and add the source, go to that local file, and then specify that criteria. Now you have other options in here that we didn't go over. There's a lot of options, we just don't have so much time, but you can start to segment out what you want to collect from your data. So you could, if you wanted to, start to use the file path to express a directory and then use the blacklist to exclude some of those files that reside in that directory. You can start to define time zones. So the data that's going to be ingested. What time zone do you want to utilize? Maybe you want to use the collector default. Maybe you want to specify, any data that gets ingested should always be Honolulu time would be a little odd, but maybe you want to specify one time zone all the time. But once you had done this, then you would click Save. And as I described, that then is communicating to Sumo Logic that information. And once you're done, you should get a screen that then looks like this. And if you don't see that 2 lines, you'll just want to go ahead and refresh the screen. And what this is showing us, the first line is showing the collector itself. The second line is showing the actual data that's being ingested. So in this case, we have our collector, JBrawl time 11 Mac, and then we have our Apache log data down here. We start to see a little graph that's showing us over the last hour the amount of data that's been ingested. And so we see over the last hour, 1,100 log messages have been ingested. Now, the other thing we can do from here, and the lab was telling us to do, is to now use this view to start to search for our data. And so what we can do is we can go to the source category and just do a little bit to the right, and there's an open in log search icon, and we can just click on it. What that's then going to do is going to take our query and bring it into, or take our source category of data and bring it into the query window. Now, by default, you might have got to the screen where you're searching for your data, but you don't see any data. And the reason you probably don't is, it's kind of our fault, is the sample file that you're using is not a full 24-hour period of data. It's data from like 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., I think. And so as a result, searching for the last 15 minutes may not show anything because the data might be older than that. So what you can do is you have 2 options in how you want to view the data to verify it's there. The first is you could go to the last 24 hours. So you'd be saying, show me all the data from the last 24 hours, which would include that data from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Or this is a place where you could use receipt time. And by using receipt time, you're saying, show me the data that has been ingested in the last 15 minutes, not necessarily is from the last 15 minutes. And so what I see here now is over the last 15 minutes, there has been data that's been ingested, and I see that data here. And so what this is showing now is we've taken data that resides on our laptop or on our personal device, and now it exists in Sumo Logic, and now we can start to query it and parse it and do whatever we want to do with it. But it was to show you that step of taking everything and bringing it in. So let's go ahead and do the next step, which is going to be part 3. This is just going to have us install an app, but I think that's useful to do because in this scenario, in a real-world scenario, you now have access to your data, but you want to see what Sumo Logic is going to provide to you in the way of dashboards and queries. And so why don't you go ahead and run through this example of installing the app. You probably have done this already, but it's worth going through quickly anyhow. So I'll give you all a few moments to do this. But in the meantime, there was a question about, can you show how to configure a collector to go to a partition? So if the partitions will actually be set up in Sumo Logic itself, but let me show you where. So go ahead and do the lab, but let's go ahead and show this as well. And then I'll give you some more time for the lab. So to set up the partition, you'll just go into the settings, and there's going to be a setting for partitions. And then to set it up, really pretty straightforward. You're going to choose the partition option and you'll click plus. Then you're just going to give the partition a name, so I don't know, Apache data. You're going to tell the system how to locate this data. So this is where you would say any data that comes in with the source category of JB/Apache 111 is automatically going to be put into this partition called Apache data. And then you're going to go ahead and define the retention period. So I only want to keep this data for 100 days. And then when I click create, make no spaces. And then going forward, this partition is now created. And it's actually being created right now. So the partition creation is done within the UI, not during the collector setup. So I hope that answers that question. Sorry for the tangent, but hopefully why don't you go ahead and play with the app. So I'll give everybody a moment or two. And I'm just going to throw myself on mute again, just to grab a sip of water. All right, so as a reminder on how to set up that app, you're going to go to the app catalog, and you're going to choose the Apache app because that's the source of data that we ingested. You're going to give the app a name. Once again, should use something kind of unique just so you know it's yours. And then you're going to tell the system where that data resides. So what source category is, or where is that data located? And then you can click Add to Library. And at this point, as a reminder, system's grabbing the data, grabbing the queries and dashboards that we think are helpful, and putting them together. And then when you run them, you should start to see your data or the lab data in this environment here. Let's see, why is nothing showing up? I probably made a typo in my source category. Let's see. Oh, yes, I called it Access instead of Apache. And that's what happens when you put the wrong one in. So I'm showing you how important it is to use the right source category. And just as a reminder, the apps, I really want to stress the importance of them because they're going to be a really nice place for you and your users to start looking at your data. So as you start to load new sources of data into Sumo Logic, regardless of the administrator role or not, just more in general, I would recommend using the app to see what we're about to provide to you, what dashboards we can give you, what queries we can give you. They're probably going to be helpful. Maybe not, but probably are, or at least a good starting point for you to see, here's a way to take the data and present it, and then maybe modify those queries, those dashboards for your needs. But I'd really encourage you to use those. I think it will help you help ease the transition of using Sumo Logic, make things easier for you. All right, so let's go back to the lab, and let's go ahead and part 4, I'm going to skip over. What part 4 has us doing is just taking the data that we ingested and now starting to create charts against it, dashboards against it. But you've done that, or hopefully you've done that previously. So I don't really want to go over the analytics, the query language at this point. This is more, that would be more of level 2, the pro user, or the security power user that we'll do in the afternoon. So we'll skip over part 4. But part 5 I do want to do, because part 5 is going to have us collecting and visualizing host metrics. And you know what, I'll actually let you guys take a stab at this first. So why don't you go ahead and attempt the lab on your own. I'll give you a couple moments, and then I'll jump in and show it. So I'll let you guys lead the way. So we're going to do part 5, and just all the steps. It should, they should be pretty clear. So go ahead and do it, and then I'll jump in about 3 minutes or so and run through the steps. All right, so let's go through this and what are we doing here? So what we're doing here is we're starting to ingest the host metrics. So as we looked at earlier with collectors, you can ingest logs, and we did that just a few moments ago. And you can start to also bring in your metrics. In this case, we're grabbing the metrics from our local device. So to do so, we're going to go to the collector. So similarly, the way we did earlier, we're going to find our collector. We're going to choose to add a source, but this time we're going to add the source of host metrics. When we do, we're going to once again need to start to give some names to this. So we're going to give a name to it. We're also going to specify a source category once again. We're going to select a scan interval. So how frequently do we want this data to be scanned for? I'm going to do a more frequent one just so I can get my data generated a little bit faster. And then we're going to decide what metrics do we want to see in Sumo Logic. I'll check all of them. And we'll click Save. At this point, once again, as described earlier, the system is now sending those commands or that information to the collector downstream. And the collector now knows, all right, now I need to send Sumo access data as well as host metric data. And now what we can do, or should be able to do, is if we click on the little icon on the collector screen, we should start to see our host metrics displayed. And we do. And so now we have information that's being grabbed from the collector, brought to Sumo Logic, and now we can start to utilize it. And then the system has us going through and just creating a query that looks specifically for a specific metric. And so if we want to look just at the metric, let's see, metric equals, I don't know which one, what do we want to look at? Disk used. Now we're starting to see the disk used metrics. So in the same way we saw for the logs, we saw specifically just the Apache data. Now we're seeing a specific metric that's being grabbed. And then what you can do is you can install an app for host metrics. Once again, hopefully I've driven home the importance of the apps, and same way here. So what we can do is we can go ahead to the app catalog and search for the host metric app, or just scroll down to it. Click Add to Library. And then once again, fill in the blanks. So give the thing a name. Specify where the data is located. Sorry about that. GB/host. Add to library. System's grabbing those host metrics, grabbing those queries, dashboard's putting them together. And now if I want to start to look at the host metric overview, now I'm looking at those metrics that are being generated and pulled from my laptop. And so now I can see my CPU idle, my CPU load, et cetera, et cetera. Cool. So that covers primarily what I wanted to go over today. So I'm going to see if there's any questions. Nope. So what I think we'll do now is we'll take the exam. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, but I don't think anybody's going to complain about that. And so let's go ahead and start to take the exam. Now, before you do, you're going to want to make sure that you log out, at least to take the exam, out of this lab account that we were using, and go ahead and log back in using your corporate or your personal Sumo Logic account. When you do, you'll want to go to the certification screen. Hopefully, if you've taken some certifications with us before. If not, that's fine, of course. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do the level 3 Sumo Power Admin exam. So what you'll do is pretty simply, you'll just click Take the Exam, and you'll start taking the exam. Now, just let me give you a little background on it if you haven't taken one of these before with us. It's going to be a 30-question exam, multiple choice. You'll have 60 minutes to take it. The questions rotate, so the questions you get and your coworker might be a little bit different. The prep for each exam, in this case, was the Setting Up Sumo webinar and the tutorial. The webinar is the portion I did this morning with the slides. The tutorial is what we just went through, so you've done that prep. And then you'll be able to take the exam. The exam is just as a reminder, is free for you, free for your organization. Great way for you to prove your knowledge of Sumo Logic. Once you're done and you complete it, you'll get a certificate. You can post it to your LinkedIn. It's now a new job skill you've learned, which is certainly a valuable thing nowadays. And then you'll be certified. So we'll go ahead and start the exam. We'll leave this line open for the next hour and a half till 9 o'clock. If you have any questions during the exam is open book, it's open resource, so you're free to use Google, free to certainly use the application, use our documentation. Also, if you do have any questions, go ahead and post those in the Q&A or the chat, and we can help assist with those. Once you're done, feel free to hang up. No need to stick around for everybody else to complete. And hopefully you'll be able to join us this afternoon. So at noon today, noon Pacific time rather, so about 4.5 hours from now, we'll do the Sumo Security Power User Cert Jam. So we'll go through that portion. So if you can attend, please do. We did record this session, so we'll go ahead and send out the recording probably this afternoon. And so if you want to share it with your team members or whatever, feel free to. But other than that, you're kind of free to begin the exam. Let's see, is there a question? Yep, we'll go ahead. There was a question just about sharing the training. We'll certainly go ahead and do that. So, yeah, so go ahead and take the exam. And I'm going to put myself on mute, but if any questions come up, we'll answer them via the chat. If there's anything kind of important for me to say, I'll just kind of announce it. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and start and conclude this call once everybody's done. So best of luck, and thank you for joining today.